Hello, everyone. Today, we are very happy to have Professor Heinzmann to give a talk, to give the first of the two talks. And I will briefly introduce the speaker, Professor Heinzmann, and also the commentator, Dr. KaiBo. So Professor Heinzmann is a professor of philosophy at University of Lorraine. His areas of specialization include Poincaré studies, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of logic, French philosophy of science in the 20th century. And he published a lot of papers and 4 monographs. And the latest book is called in English, Epistemic Intuition, a pragmatic approach to the context of justification in mathematics and in philosophy. And he's also the founder and editor-in-chief of the journal Philosophia Scientia. He's the director of the book collection called Publications of the Henry Poncare Archives. Also, Professor Heinzmann has a lot of honorary titles. He is a member of the Academia Europaea, member and former president of the International Academy for Philosophy of Science, a member of the European Academy of Sciences, member of International Institute of Philosophy. He's also an assessor of the Council of Division of Logic, Methodology, and Philosophy of Science and Technology. And also he is the president of the organizing committee of the 14th International Congress of Logic, Methodology, and Philosophy of Science. So we have a commentator today, and he's my colleague, Dr. KaiBo. He got his PhD from University of Amsterdam, and he now works as an associate researcher in philosophy in the School of Philosophy at Wuhan University. His areas of specialization include causation, epistemic logic, formal semantics, and he published many papers in journals such as Journal of Logic and Computation, and also Studies in Logic. And last year, he co-authored a book entitled Analyzing the Logic of Sunzi in the Art of War using mind maps. And it was published last year. So I will let Professor Heinzmann start his talk. And the title of his talk today is Poncare and the Analytic Tradition. So please go ahead, Professor.
Thank you very much. Now I should so can you see?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much, Professor Fan, and I'm very honored to give this talk today. And I now already Professor Gerhard by the Academy of International Academy of Philosophy of Science. He gave a talk 2 years ago, and we know it from the International Institute of Philosophy too. So thank you very much. I'm very honored. So the title of my talk is Poincaré and the Analytic Tradition. The plan is perhaps I saw something about will say something about Poincaré. He's a mathematician and philosopher, and he was born in Nancy. And this is the reason why I could organize and found the Poincaré Archive in the town of Nancy. Naturally, it was in the University of Paris. So the plan of this talk is first the introduction, then second chapter, Henri Poincaré as frontier commuters between Kantianism and logical empiricism. Third chapter, the origin of analytic philosophy revisited. French philosophy and logical empiricism. B. Poincaré and revisions in the analytic traditions. Fourth chapter, some general elements of Poincaré's philosophy. And finally, three characteristics of Poincaré's philosophy that are at the same time arguments in favor of Poincaré as a philosopher in analytic tradition. Now I come first to the introduction. My general question of this talk is, are there systematic or historic relations between French philosophy of science and the analytic tradition? Normally, the answer was no, and my answer is different. The main thesis is analytic philosophy of science has one of its origin in the philosophical network in France around 1900. Of course, all depends on what is meant by analytic philosophy of science. First, so I should define every term. What is philosophy? It is easier to say what philosophy is not than what it is. To be a philosopher is not to be a scientist. In philosophy, there are no theorems and there are no questions which can be decided by yes or no, said Heinzmann. Philosophy also is opposed to the history of philosophy. Nevertheless, I think philosophy is by no means an independent discipline. The separation of philosophy from science and humanity is not a systematically justified separation. It is only the result of a historical development. More positively, philosophy subjects every action, whatever, to a reflexive aspect. The philosopher reflects about our reflection concerning the world and our life situation. The philosopher discovered nothing, but he invents something. He invents the reflexive framework of our theoretical and practical action. What means to be a philosopher of science? Under the guise of theory of knowledge, which interested us here, I propose the following answer. Under that definition of philosophy I gave in the last slide, the philosopher of science should invent the conceptual framework of scientific knowledge. Thus, the philosopher of science should devise the conceptual presuppositions that are at the root of our scientific knowledge and clarify this activity in a symbolic form, because naturally science is symbolic, is done in symbolic forms. What is analytic philosophy? Now, there is no substantive agreement about the philosophical views of analytic philosophers. Analytic philosophy is by no means a school. Nevertheless, for much of analytic philosophers, logical analysis is widely recognized to be important. According to Jules Villemin, is an analytic philosopher in France, let's say in 2001, the analytical philosophy admits and even institutes a triple division between what is reasonable and what is not, between the right and the false, especially between the true and the false, or at least, according to the skeptical option of this philosophy, between the authentic appearance and the illusion. So, analytic philosophy, in the broad sense, the only relevant on can only be characterized, if at all, by a style, or better, by a certain spirit. Which spirit is it? Perhaps, quite simply, the scientific spirit. Characterize it François Recanati, it's a French philosopher with an analytic philosophy. He is currently the chair in the Collège de France in Paris. So François Recanati turns to Ajdukiewicz. Ajdukiewicz is a Polish philosopher. It is you see, I give his date. So he says, the scientific character can be attributed only to that kind of intellectual effort that goes beyond individual consciousness and becomes a common good. This is in 1936. This statement by Ajdukiewicz is echoed by the following quote from Hans Reichenbach. Naturally, you know all this name. Hans Reichenbach said, the social character of scientific work is the source of its strength. The resources of the community are added to the limited power of the individual. The errors of the individual are corrected by other members of the community and from the respective contribution of many intelligent individuals results a kind of supra-personal collective intelligence, capable of finding answers that an isolated individual could never discover. I like where it is because naturally I introduced here in France the dialogical philosophy, which is based a little bit on this, of the German philosopher Kuno Lorenz. I will talk in the next talk about this, about philosophy of language. So theological philosophy of language. So from the parenthesis. So scientific research in Recanati's conception is characterized by intersubjectivity. It progresses through a mutual criticism of the members of the scientific community who correct each other. And this is very good, thus I have a commentator today. This is exactly in this sense. The scientific spirit of the analytic philosophy holds in the fact that the research is similarly intersubjective and progresses as in science by the mutual criticism of the members of the community. Naturally, in science, this is always done. In philosophy, it's not so always done. And Recanati concludes to the idea that progress is possible in philosophy, one should attach another characteristic trait of analytic philosophy, the refusal to confuse philosophy with the history of philosophy, and a certain courtliness towards the great philosophers of the past. As we know, analytic philosophers are primarily interested in philosophical problems, which they try to solve or dissolve. This is especially Goodman's case. And if they're interested in what the great philosophers of the past said, it is secondarily by interest in the problems these philosophers were facing. And this is my attitude concerning Poincaré. Consequently, the attitude of analytic philosophers towards the great philosophers of the past is not essentially different, it has often been stressed, from their attitude toward their own colleagues. A collaborative attitude with respect does not exclude criticism, where respect does not exclude criticism. So, the analytic tradition of philosophy of science is perhaps characterized by overlapping similarities which run as follows. First, put up a thesis facing the academic community and try to argue for it, not by historical references, but by considering A, the arguments of the field specialist. B, the conceptual presupposition and the linguistic level. C, the methodical, metaphysical presuppositions, realists, anti-realists, pragmatists or not, as you say this clearly. D, eventually technical tools, context dependency, logic, cognitive science, etc. Secondly, rationality is based on interaction and belief revision. This is a point which I take from my friend von Bentham, Johann von Bentham. KaiBo, I know him because he started in Amsterdam. So we are really, we know us very well. So that rationality is based on interaction and belief revision, very important. And third, there is a core of analytic philosopher who should be included as historical perspective of 1 and 2. This is now perhaps what is not common for analytic philosopher, but in fact, Quine is natürlich Quine as the example, the incarnate of analytic philosophy, naturally. And he does it too from time to time to include historical perspectives. Now, anyway, these criteria are sufficient to make Charles Sanders Peirce an analytic philosopher of science and to exclude, for example, Bergson or Heidegger or others from our perspectives. Now, Henri Poincaré is the main figure of the French network around 1900. Can he include in a philosopher in the analytic tradition? So naturally from a perspective of today. Henri Poincaré wrote no proper philosophical work. He wrote 5 books. This was collections of articles: Science and Hypothesis, The Value of Science, Science and Method, the last essays, and Scientific Opportunism. So 5 books, but these 5 books are not just essays of articles. Clearly, the historical proponents of analytic philosophy, Frege and Russell, did not influence Poincaré in a positive way. And Poincaré used no logical analysis, but refused nevertheless the old metaphysics. He said, "Those who consider metaphysics since Auguste Comte, the French positivists, as old-fashioned, tell me that there can be no modern metaphysics. But the negation of all metaphysics is still metaphysics. And this is precisely what I call modern metaphysics." So you see that the way, as reasons Poincaré, obviously, he is a very, he's a thinker. He's a thinker, a genius thinker. I will just recall some anecdote. If he received of all the world questions of other mathematicians, he read just what the questions was, and he was not going to the proof of other people. He gave already himself a new proof on the questions. So there's a very, very natural, special kind of intelligence. Now, regarding conceptual analysis, mathematician has already learned at the end of the 19th century what analytic philosophers attained only in the 1950s. Weierstrass and the mathematician monsters, that means non-differentiable continuous functions, and other monsters, so contrary to common sense, could not be blamed on purely understood notions as in times of indivisibles. Say Bourbaki. Bourbaki is a community of French mathematicians. Rather, the logical conceptual analysis created these counterintuitive facts. What I will say is the following. If you have in analytic philosophy or in mathematics counterintuitive facts, you should perhaps think about, because it is not naturally the intuition is not very helpful, but nevertheless, intuition is helpful in everyday work. So there is a problem. There is the problem. I give the following example. You say that the cardinality of the real numbers is greater as the cardinality of the natural numbers. And naturally, you say that the cardinality of the natural numbers is the same as the cardinality of pair numbers. But this is not intuitive. And Cantor's definition to take the equivalence, to take the what it is called in English, that you have the principle to correspondence, one unique element to each element of the other example. How it is called? I have this the principle that you can, as for the cardinality, to take the function that's give to one example exactly one element of the other set, to one set exactly one element of the other set. This principle is not clear. Why should we not take das subset is of less higher cardinality as a set? Why should we not take this one? And in fact, Italian peoples 5 years ago take this one, and then mathematics is completely different. So you see this question: what take you basic criteria of intuitivity in mathematics is very, very important to do mathematics. And so while mathematicians have been for a long time conscious that the conceptual analysis is per se not sufficient if you are not guided by an explicit insights, philosophers were only conscious of this fact by the criticism of Carnap language program. Finally, of Wittgenstein's criticism, that Carnap says, oh, we should have a formal language to precise the normal language, the intuitive language. But naturally, why the formal language is a picture of the normal language? Don't you have a meta language? And this meta language, but it's the same problem. What is the status of the meta language? So these are problems which are a long time now in mathematics, and it was a sensation in philosophy, in analytic philosophy, as the Wittgenstein discovered that the the program of formal semantics is not sufficient to give insights in the normal language. Okay, now Henri Poincaré was obviously a mathematician, an astronomer, and a physicist, but was he a philosopher? According to Karl Popper, he was a very great philosopher, the greatest philosopher of science. Is this not an excessive judgment? Where is the philosophical work? Is it not exhausted in 4 or 5 collections of articles? How can he be compared to other scholars whose names evoke beyond any doubt the quality of very great philosophers such as Locke, Kant, Peirce, Bergson, Russell, or Quine? I will argue in the next chapters that Poincaré is interested in the conceptual presupposition of scientific knowledge, clarifies the scientific activity in its symbolic form, invents a useful conceptual framework. Finally, I try to argue in the last chapter that Poincaré's philosophy is of an analytic style type. Is our question of any systematic interest? Why should it be interesting to know if Poincaré can be seen in the analytic tradition or not? I'm not primarily interested neither in history of science nor in the history of philosophy. In this talk, I don't emphasize neither the historical context nor the historical stringency of Poincaré's argumentation. I'm interested in philosophy. My thesis is that Poincaré's position is in effect very actual for today's problem in analytic philosophy of science, especially concerning mathematics. Now, what are actual problems in philosophy of mathematics? In the last decades, many studies have been aimed to overcome classical philosophical position in mathematical ontologies and epistemology as Platonism, nominalism, formalism, but also structuralism by looking at mathematical practice as a source for new questions or, secondary, for new answers to old questions. This was facilitated by the fact that more studies of mathematical process rather than just of mathematical products were now took into account. For example, how are informal arguments related to formal arguments? This was Poincaré's main question. And this is the principle Cantor's bisection. No, that you have. I return to it. The bisection principles to measure cardinality. This is naturally. This is an intuition, but there are other intuitions. Why not take the subset condition to measure cardinality? Okay. So I return to my talk. From Poincaré to Quine. Poincaré's philosophical approach must be related among these sources of analytical tradition that seem to be at the same time sources of Quine's criticism of the 2 dogmas of the logical empiricism. The dogma of the separation of observational and theoretical language, and the dogma of the possible reduction of empirical meaning to experience. Consequently, Poincaré might survive logical empiricism. Is Poincaré an anti-modernist? We will see that Poincaré's conventions in geometry are empirically underdetermined and neither analytic nor scientific. Now, this exactly could be an argument to use Poincaré and his polemics against Russell, Couturat, Cantor, and Hilbert as important player in the fight against analytic philosophy. Because naturally, in fact, Quine too, he returns to a point which was actual before the logical empiricism. It was, and is the case in France, that Poincaré was said it's an anti-modernist. Indeed, such an interpretation leads to a potentially misleading understanding of his philosophical insights, and is the reason why my main question is worth addressing not only from the historical point of view. The following remarks on Wittgenstein of Hans-Joachim Klock. Hans-Joachim Klock is a very known commentator of Wittgenstein. He is in Switzerland, in Zurich, can be word by word transposed by substituting Poincaré for Wittgenstein. So what Hans-Joachim Klock says about Wittgenstein is valid for Poincaré. He says, at present, there is also an increasing mutual isolation between, now I leave Poincaré, he says always Wittgenstein, between Poincaré's scholarship and Poincarean philosophy on the one hand, and mainstream analytic philosophy on the other. In my view, this isolation is detrimental to both sides. Poincaré presents us with highly original claims and arguments, which deserves to be taken seriously by contemporary analytic philosophers, since they challenge some of their basic assumptions. At the same time, Poincaré's scholarship and Poincarean philosophy can profit from reconstructionist idea in an analytic fashion. So this I take exactly what Klock does for Wittgenstein, I do for Poincaré. Now you know all, I'm sure, Michael Dummett. And he says, Michael Dummett is in his very famous lecture, Origins of Analytic Philosophy, he says, a grave historical distortion arises from a prevalent modern habit of speaking of analytical philosophy as Anglo-American. This terminology utterly distorts the historical context in which analytic philosophy came to birth, in the light of which it would be better be called Anglo-Austrian than Anglo-American. I propose to substitute Anglo-Austrian French for Anglo-Austrian. Okay. Surely, Dummett's criterion expresses just the point 1b in my list above, that to consider conceptual proposition at the linguistic level, and could be accepted by important members of the hermeneutic and post-structuralistic movements too, such as Heidegger, Gamma, and Derrida, which I will exclude naturally. But from a methodological point of view, I emphasize in this space neither the historical context nor the mathematical stringency of Poincaré's argumentation. I'm indeed interested in the question if Poincaré's writing gives the conceptual possibility to classify him in 2023 as belonging to the analytic tradition. Whether the analytic tradition is considered as a sociological or a philosophical phenomenon, I think that Poincaré is closer to it than Bergson, Bachelard, Brunswick, or Heidegger. Chapter 2. The philosopher Poincaré as frontier commuters between Kantianism and logical empiricism. In the introduction of his famous booklet, Science and Hypothesis, Poincaré mentions hypotheses as necessary conditions for mathematicians' constructions. But then he continues, the doubt arises if all constructions are built on solid foundations. He recommends indeed to doubt everything or to believe everything are two equally convenient solutions. Both spare us from thinking. We should seek for criteria to argue for a balanced position. This is Asquine, I think. This was Poincaré's genuine philosophical questions. In his metaphorical answer that philosophically recalls Hobbes And politically, Stanislas, the Polish king of Lorraine, in fact, Stanislas was an old Polish king, which was then later Duke of Lorraine. He says, our laws allow those of an absolute monarch who is wise and consults his council of state. More seriously, Poincaré's general solution is based according to his own opinion on the distinction between what is experience, what is mathematical reasoning, what is convention, and what is hypothesis. So this distinction of the different of this different notion is in Poincaré's thinking. And I repeat, it is not so in a philosophical thesis, but it should be analyzed in his mathematical work. There exists a serious difficulty because there exists two traditions of interpreting Poincaré's work. One which endorses his intuitionistic tendency and at the same time is polemic against logicism and formalism. This is the continental tradition. So Poincaré strongly disagreed with Russell and Frege, claiming that intuition was the life of mathematics and that he uses of metaphors as a sign of continental vagueness, and another tradition which opts for the conventional linguistic aspects of his work, with the analytical tradition, thus makes of him as initiator of the linguistic turn. This is so naturally the analytic tradition. I think none of them are completely right, and this is now a modern form, which is now the form, I think, of the analytic tradition more of today, not of yesterday. Two questions. Is Poincaré a borderline case, or can one decide to put Poincaré in one of these traditions? If yes, what is the criterion? I think it is a borderline case. So, Poincaré and neo-Kantianism. It is obvious and was never contested that Poincaré was strongly influenced by and integrated in a philosophical movement related to a mixture of empiricism and neo-Kantianism. According to Poincaré, mathematics requires intuition not only in the context of discovery, but also in the context of justification, especially in arithmetic and logic. So it is not surprising that Poincaré was even introduced in German philosophical circles by the Kantian traditions. Example are Moritz Schlick, Alois Riel, and his follows Ilse Schneider. You know, but not all these main, but it is important just for Germany. Is Poincaré neo-Kantian? The pure intuition Poincaré introduces is intellectual. In Kant, you know, intuition is always in the sensibility, in character. And Poincaré does not at all solve the problem of the unity of spontaneity and receptivity by the introduction of pure sensibility. This is Kant. In our human constitution, there is one, the intellect, and on the other side, which is spontaneous, and on the other side, the sensibility, which is passive. Rather, he changed the terms of the Kantian opposition. What is important for him is the balance between exactness and objectivity. And objectivity concerns the consensus with respect to natural relations. Yeah, das ist how our mathematical symbolism is connected to the to intuition or to intuitive facts necessary for understand. But you can do, as a logicians, logic without understand logic, without understand why a logical proof is true. This is Poincaré's insight. He is not interested in logical rigor. I will return it, just say it already now. Thus, mathematical proofs should be rigorous is trivial. And no mathematician is interested in a logical, completely correct proof. This is presupposed. Thus, one should translate it in purely logical form. But nobody does it, only by computers. And then you have, naturally, programs that you should control the computers. What Poncare is interested in is what is the insight that a mathematician without a logical proof gives a true mathematical proof, which is not translated in logic. This is the point. Poincaré expresses the lost balance between exactness and objectivity in a formula well known by its popularization under Einstein's pen. What mathematics have gained in rigor, they have lost in objectivity. It is by distancing themselves from reality that they acquired this perfect purity. This is why Poincaré didn't confine himself with a perfect purity. This is easy to receive perfect purity, but to understand these other things. From Poincaré to Schlick via Koffer. Albert Koffer is American commentators of logical empiricism noted that Moritz Schlick quandary sounds very analogous to Poincaré. He says, Koffer about Schlick, explicit definition from given primitives gives representations that are linked to reality, but it can guarantee no more intersubjectivity than is available in the starting point. Since its starting point otherwise consists of the subjective target of ostension, singular representation, it preserves the link with the reality at a price to give no solution to the problem how to explain the rigorous character of scientific knowledge. In contrast, implicit definition achieves sharpness, but the price is a complete lack of relation to the world. A Kantian heritage of logical empiricism was always very known in Germany, where Paul Lorenzen, he is the most important mathematician and a German analytic philosopher, and Wolfgang Stegmüller represented the German, but not Austrian, tradition of the so diametrically opposed minds as Schlick and Carnap. And since Friedman's seminal book, Reconsidering Logical Positivism, it is even well established in the United States. It is crazy. Michael Friedman, he announced that Schlick and Carnap are in a Kantian tradition, but this is a trivial in the German philosophy. But it should be American, he said it, and then all analytic philosophers believe it. It is very strange. That's a strange situation, but no, we are in the world as we are. Okay, as for Neo-Kantian and Poincaré, the Kantian a priori synthetic concept has given rise to aporia, the monster in mathematics. Different logical equivalent theories, they are not completely logical, the topological, not equivalent, but okay, reduction of mathematics to logic, and Hume's principle and so on, which logically empiricism meant to overcome by postulating what Quine called the two dogmas already mentioned above. Now, Kantism and logical empiricism, given the fact that logical empiricism was influenced in a negative and positive way by the Kantian tradition, it should not be surprising that Poincaré was similarly influenced by this tradition too, or better, Poincaré's Kantian vocabulary is the expression of a non-academic but nevertheless systematic philosopher, does not prevent reading his work from the point of view of logical empiricism. Poincaré was naturally a mathematician, but he was a thinker. It is equally French tradition and logical empiricism. It's equally known that among those who were considered as forerunners of the logical empiricists, Duhem distinguished himself by the fact that he seems to be at the same time a forerunner of Quine's criticism. The Duhem-Quines holistic thesis concerns the calling in question of the separation of theoretical language from the observation language. Poincaré had not a change to be mentioned so prominently by an Anglophone philosopher as Quine. However, he too must be ranked among those foreigners who survived Quine's criticism, not primarily for his holistic thesis, but for his conception of geometrical convention as a kind of bicephalous selection of non-synthetic and non-logical propositions, guided at the same time by experience. But I look naturally on Quine's refutations of the distinction principle analytic synthetic. His conventions were trivialized as purely linguistic decisions. In other words, it is but rarely been attempted to describe the phrase guided by experience another meaning than that of a metaphor. How can we guide it by experience? What it means? This I will try to explain. And it's probably not easy to do so without having first read a later Wittgenstein, because we should have a philosophy, an analytic philosophy of action. Now, a Rorty-like solution, rational reconstruction. In order to explain my thesis more fully, I want to introduce some methodological remarks. We may want to go on to ask questions like this. What would Poincaré to say about logical empiricism? But we shall not describe the answer, we envisage him going to such a question as description of what he meant or did. This means that we are interested not only what the Poincaré who walked the streets of Nancy could be brought to accept as correct description of what he meant, but in what an ideally reasonable and educable Poincaré could be brought to accept as such a description. You see that I brought a Rorty-like solution, rational reconstruction. Rational reconstruction versus historical construction. In historical reconstruction, we confine our investigation by reconstructing the historical context, by arguing that the first study of the philosopher is to understand the thesis of the historical person with respect to the time. But we cannot find out what somebody means prior to finding out his linguistic practice resembles and differs from ours. The assumption that historical reconstruction is naturally prior to rational reconstruction seems to be the rest of an insufficiently holistic account of interpretation. Now, the ambition to locate the development of analytic philosophy from the linguistic turn of logical empiricism to its practical turn in contemporary philosophy of science in the inheritance of Poincaré does not go without saying. One cannot overlook the tension governing the history of reception of Poincaré's work. Nevertheless, in terms of a holistic account of interpretation, Poincaré is a philosopher of analytic tradition. I try to interpret his metaphors in a clear way, despite of his often aphoristic and ironic style. It's not my question if, in arguing as he did, he was always consistent. Definitely, I think he was not, but to find out what lies behind the system he has built. He was not consistent in difficult mathematical concerns, but this I will not try. Now, third chapter, the reaching of analytical philosophy revisited. How many times? know it is already. Which is second. Yes, I have 40 minutes. Okay. French philosophy and logical empiricism. First, I will give an overview of some connection between French philosophy of science and its extension by logical empiricists. Secondly, I will present the development in the analytic tradition, which is compatible in several points with Poincaré's original critique of the fathers of logical empiricism. The Polish group. Conventionalism was a main topic in the Polish group and especially started by Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz. As a 23-year-old student in Göttingen, he had been familiarized with Hilbert's and Poincaré's philosophy of mathematics. Ajdukiewicz so-called radical conventionalism and its Poincarean background was analyzed in a magistral way by Gdymin, a Polish man. For Carnap, Ajdukiewicz attempt at a general syntactical investigation was with Taskis one of the most important forerunner of his own investigations. Leon Twistig, too, was strongly influenced by Poincaré, not by the conventional, but by the constructive aspect of his work. He developed type theory and rational semantic, which could be successfully applied to solving problems connected with philosophy, science, social theory, and art. More generally, papers of Poincaré, Duhem, and Federico Enriquez, the Italian, were read and discussed in the circles, and there's not only a direct exchange between Duhem and Mach, but also an indirect exchange between Mach and Poincaré about the genesis of geometry. In 1905, Mach, Erkenntnisse und Irrtum appears. This book includes 3 chapters on the genesis of geometry, among which the last 2 are an explicit assumption of articles also in the Monist in 1902 and 1903. On the advice of Marx himself, the translator of Erkenntnis und Irrtum in French removes in 1908 these 2 chapters in the French version because they would repeat what Mr. Poincaré wrote on the question. Philipp Frank planned so early as 1907 to establish a synthesis of Mach's economic description of observed facts and Poincaré's free creation from human mind, which together he thought what is the origin of what was later called logical empiricism. The Manifesto of the Vienna Circle, 1929, confirms the systematic and historical relation by echoing Poincaré's conventionalism. Otto Neurath emphasized in 1931 that the Vienna Circle seeks to create a climate which will be free from metaphysics by continuing the work of Mach, Poincaré, Frege, Wittgenstein, and others. And the inauguration address of the Descartes Congress, Louis Rouchier and Philippe Frank emphasize again the French relation to logical empiricism. Poincaré exercised a big influence on the groups of Vienna and of Prague, where doctrine of Bergson, Meyerson, and Boutroux were rejected. Louis Rouchier was one of the rare French philosophers who did not limit the positive reception of Poincaré's work to his psychologistic and intuitionistic part, but linked conventionalism and logic. In his 1913 paper entitled Poincaré, la mort de vérité, and Poincaré and the death of necessary truth, he uses, as do later Schlick and Carnap, Poincaré's famous flatland model of the Lobachevskian geometry by supposing a world endowed with a peculiar temperature field in order to deduce the conventional character of physical geometry with respect to contingent circumstances of our milieu. Further, Rouchier sees this conventional character increased for Hilbert type formalism of all sorts. This extension of Poincaré geometrical conventionalism to physics and its largely unhistorical interpretation was common to much of the logical empiricists, especially Moritz Schlick and Rudolf Carnap. Historical relation between Poincaré and Alvarez, the crowd of documents contained in Jules Henry Graeber's PhD thesis, a thesis of me, shows that a movement in France around 1900 is related to the thesis of the unified science. It is not only Poincaré's delimitation of hypotheses unifying the concept of assumption for different branches of science that creates this unification. It is certainly not only ontological in the sense in the sense of the Aristotelian tradition is well respected, but also an important practical turn. Discussions are conducted in magazines. The teaching of philosophy is enriched with scientific background. The organization of congress internationalized the movement. So this was all what is actually in the practical term today was in fact around 1900 in French. Louis Couderat, who called Poincaré his scholarly collaborator, is the main organizer of the first International Congress of Philosophy held in Paris in 1900, during which the word epistemology is used by Jean Villebois instead of the formula critique of science or general criticism of science, in order to emphasize the philosophical reflection facing the growing powers of what we call today technoscience. Poincaré and the revisions in the analytic traditions. Until the late 1980s, Frege was the main reference for the origin of both modern logic and analytic philosophy. This perspective was corrected in 4 steps. Gianni Bestic introduced Bolzano. Damit introduced Bolzano, Brentano, Meinung, and Husserl. Alberto Cova's book entitled The Semantic Tradition from Carnap to Kant to the Vienna Station introduced Neo-Kantism. Amerius Muktevi in Tallinn established that Frege's work is not the first step of modern logic. An overlapping period, Carroll, should be recognized. We add a 5th one, this is the Poincaré circle. Thus, one has to acknowledge different results of revision with respect to Poincaré's time concerning the philosophical context and, of course, the technical developments of logic. By considering Poincaré's own criticism of modern formal logic, one could draw out the following points. Anti-psychologism was not only a Fregean endeavor, but also an attempt of Bolzano, Husserl, Meinung, and partially of Poincaré. If the meaning of a proposition is not to be situated in the consciousness, as by Husserl, it seems that it has to be situated in the domain as different from the psychological world as from the interior world of private events. Frege introduced for this reason a third empire, different from social phenomena, and Poincaré restricted his convention, it is true, to special domains. The source of logical empiricism was not only the Fregean, but also the Neo-Kantian tradition. A misleading stereotypical characterization views logical empiricism as concerned to provide a philosophical certification of scientific knowledge without any historical consideration. But in reality, logical empiricism follows very often the Neo-Kantian approach. Its aim is rather to reform metaphysics in accordance with the already achieved success of the exact science. Poincaré too is involved in a philosophical tradition related to a mixture of empiricism and neo-Kantism, and his aim is to explain scientific progress. Thus, his true condition have to be supplemented by logical research on understanding truth. In the philosophical-mathematical tradition, the epistemic attitude, providing that something is true, Gewissmachung in German, has always prevailed over the etiological attitude, proving why something is true, die Begründung, with the most notable exception of Bolzano. According to him, Bolzano, a proof must not only give the reason, but also contain a semi-formal element to ensure the understanding. Poincaré's conception of understanding a proof echoes this tradition. Classical first-order logic is not sufficient. Schindicker's independently friendly logic, an improved version of the traditional Fregean first-order logic, is such a powerful tool that there is no longer any need to resort to set theory for the purpose of doing model theory of first-order logic, of expressing complete induction. Consequently, Poincaré's criticism concerning formal logic in its application to mathematics vanished with the invention of if logic. Indeed, far from being the only relevant development, the dialogical approach of logic conceives in the frame of Martin Löff's constructive type theory a belief system in which the acquisition of knowledge as an ideal limit and the interaction aspect of meaning are perceived as a question-response game in respect to a set of initial hypotheses that are expressed at the very level and object language. This is the criticism of Martin Löff. He is going already to reduce what is the insight in the object language, and this is the same circle as it's already discovered by Wittgenstein, and was is avoided by Poincaré. Belief is always a potential construction. Belief is always a potential construction, so long as we consider the potential and the actual as really distinct, and as Poincaré did. In this perspective, Poincaré's criticism concerning non-constructive set theory vanished. Okay. Some general elements of Poincaré's philosophy. Poincaré always defends the same philosophy. It consists in a reconstruction program of the process of understanding scientific theories, where the construction of scientific objects is simultaneously conceived with the construction of language, or more exactly, where the empirical basis is the occasion of the process of language learning. But this I will this idea I will give in the next lecture. Poincaré distinguishes a priori principles, for example, complete induction in arithmetic, from conventions as apparent hypothesis, for example, the parallel axiom in geometry, and from true hypothesis, for example, the hypothesis of central forces in physics. Placed side by side, all these notions express local forms, one in arithmetic, one in geometry, one in physics, specific to different fields considered. Of Poincaré's philosophical problem, whose principal subject is, and I emphasize, the epistemological question of the relational form of scientific knowledge and its exact symbolic formalization. It means, what means this from the passage from formal to informal language? The counting process now in arithmetic, how it is conceived in arithmetic for Poincaré, the counting process conceived as an indefinite repetition, naturally this is an empirical process, is occasioned by experience without being itself empirical. No, I repeat, the counting process conceived as an indefinite repetition, this is not empirical, is occasioned by experience, by the experience that I can count 1, 2, 3, but not more. 1, 2, 3, 4, naturally 2, but I cannot indefinite repetition. So the indefinite repetition, there is a parameter. You should introduce a parameter to have indefinite repetition, but naturally counting there's a without parameter. So at this, the indefinite repetition is a theoretical part of our knowledge. What do you say in definition? You can do 1, and if you can n, you can n1. But n is a parameter. For n, you should, the first one, and then you get on the first one, you can add the second one. This is a big reflection was it there to parameter. You should, this is on a not on an object level, it's a level more a higher level. So experience is the ratio cognoscendi of the affirmation of the fact that if a domain can be structured through an act of an indefinite repetition, a property is valid if for all elements it is valid for the successor of any element. So this is naturally the principle of induction. In arithmetic, we seem to use neither hypothesis nor convention, but not a repetitive intellectual intuition. It is a known cognitive capacity about entities, but about what we are able to do. Not about entities, but about what we are able to do. One might argue that Poincaré was mistaken to include arithmetic in his book Science and Hypothesis, if arithmetic is not a non-hypothetical nature. I think that he was in no way mistaken. What is important here is that his principle is understood to be a structural element of empirical investigation. We have the faculty of conceiving that a unit might be added to a collection of units. Thanks to experiment, we have had the opportunity of exercising this faculty and are conscious of it. I will perhaps explain this point because this is very important. How many reflections are necessary to understand the complete induction and what it is necessary to do this next time. Perhaps I will do this. From this point of view, the principle of complete induction as a necessary tool of mathematics is very close to Poincaré's understanding of the principle of empirical induction. The latter is a natural hypothesis or a practical rule in the sense of a necessary tool of physics, which signifies that the fact is the continuous function of its cause. This striking analogy of complete induction with the usual process of induction lies in their function to be tools in order to structure different domains. These tools are suggested by experience, but are themselves inaccessible to experience. Poincaré's operative intuition is epistemic in character, signifies to take the decision that indefinite repetition occasioned by experience is a necessary tool for arithmetic. Poincaré's inclusion of arithmetic under the book's title Science and Hypothesis might thus be justified in the following way. The priori status of mathematical induction contrasts well with usual hypothesis, but there is a striking analogy between the principle of mathematical induction and the status of natural hypothesis. Both are experimentally inaccessible rules. Poincaré is sometimes intuitionist and sometimes formalist. He supports always the same position adapted to the mathematical content. Now, geometric space is obtained by choosing the language or scope to serve as a tool of reasoning about a representation of muscular sensation. As in Carnap's Aufbau, the starting point, guided by experience, is for Poincaré the definition of two-place relation satisfying certain minimal empirical condition. An external change A with XAY for X change in Y without muscular sensation. You see a car which is passing and you have no muscular sensation. But there is a change of sensation, the car passes. Okay. And an external and the internal change S with X as Y for X changes in Y accompanied by muscular sensation. Imagine you look at the sphere. The sphere is red on your side and this is yellow on my side. And then you can turn around the sphere and then you see the yellow sphere and I see the red sphere. So There's a change, but the change is accompanied by muscular sensation. Now, further, he proceeds to a conventional classification of external change. Among external change, some can be compensated by an internal change, others cannot. If you have a glass of water and the biochemistry process, the water is changing from without color in a red color, you can turn it around, but the color is not changing. But change of position, here you have a movement. This gives you see, Poincaré will understand geometry, and geometry is based on motion. And what he is doing is that motion of these sorts are groups, because there are inverse elements. If I do nothing, this is the zero element of the group, and so on. And modulo, it's very complicated. Modulo an identity condition with respect to compensation by internal change. Poincaré defines the equivalence class of change of position and calls this a displacement. A displacement is a change, equivalence class of change of positions. And displacements, he considers, he says, and he even proves, form a group in the mathematical sense, and it depends of the choice of its subgroups, whether the groups corresponds to Euclidean or non-Euclidean geometry. Here's Poincaré's criterion for non-Euclidean geometry: the existence of an invariant subgroup of which all displacements are interchangeable and which is formed out of all translation. In fact, the geometry of Euclid corresponds to the only group containing such an invariant group well-founded by immediate experience, he says. Consequently, the so-called axioms of Euclidean existence is not a definition by convention in a strictly linguistic sense, but a result of epistemic classification, of subgroup of groups, and groups describes all three sorts of geometry of constant curvatures. The Feynman group properties are not empirical. They also cannot be result of an a priori reasoning. They are suggested by experience, and operation and muscular sensation are rigorously, that means conventionally, adapted to exactly defined group operation corresponding to imaginable experience. Experience plays a double role. It is at the same time the occasion for introducing the group, its ratio cognoscendi, and the coordinate definition in order to conceive of reality. It had but rarely been attempted to ascribe to the phrase guided by experience another meaning than that of a metaphor, and it is probably not evident to do so without having first read the second Wittgenstein. Poincaré's convention would be called disguised definition for two reasons. They are neither proper definitions nor proper descriptions. They are distinguished by mixed form, which finds a community of spirit in Nelson Goodman's reflexive equilibrium principle. It is the endpoint of a deliberate process in which we reflect on and revise our beliefs against other beliefs we hold, looking for ways in which some of these beliefs support others, seeking coherence among the widest set of beliefs and revising and refining them at all levels when challenged to some arises from others. You see, this is the point, this is my point. Here in mathematics, in the 19th century, it was done, was so Nelson Goodman, as equilibrium principle, and analytic philosophers go on and say, oh, this is now the philosophical discovering of the reflective equilibrium, which was done by Poincaré. But naturally, you should understand mathematics to understand it. This is the point. Logic. According to Poincaré, mathematics requires intuition not only in the context of discovery, but equally in the context of justification. We have already seen that in arithmetic, intellectual intuition is necessary to understand the complete induction principle. From 1905 on, Poincaré thus refuses the two-fold logicistic thesis, double thesis, to be able to prove all mathematical truths with the help of purely topic-neutral logical means, and a logical proof is sufficient for our standing of mathematical reasoning. This is naturally the main point. Now, first argument, the logicians make in fact an unequivocal use of the term logic, thus they no longer sow to the traditional kind, but a new logic containing principles of synthetic proof or formation of non-logical concepts. Now, logic for Poincaré was syllogism, but he was right. And not only it is the modern first-order logic of predicates richer than the traditional logic, but one was even led to expand logic by certain set theoretical postulate of existence, or to represent mathematical reasoning by means of a second-order logic. And even this is not obvious, as you know, because if it is second-order logic, yeah, you will introduce impredicativity, in fact, and this is not allowed if you will understand mathematics. So this, but this I will go on the next time. Now, today's admitted duality, the second argument, today's admitted duality of a logical topic-neutral inference from a position P to a position Q in Tarski's conception, every model of P is a model of Q is not enough to sustain epistemic growth of mathematical knowledge. As Michael Detlefsen remarks, such a growth requires rather that P be seen mathematically to imply Q. It is thus P and Q be seen as united by common mathematical structure. Detlefsen is right when he writes, Poincaré was not so much opposed to logicism as to the logicization of mathematical proof. What does this mean that the premises and the conclusion of mathematical reasoning are unified by epistemic consensus, that are devices which serve to bridge our reasoning and our calculation? If formalization and the universal calculus are then no longer the criterion of mathematical rigor, how shall rigor be maintained? Poincaré's answer: he insists on the non-invariance of mathematical reasoning with respect to its content and advance, so to speak, a local conception of reasoning. So it's not its logic, it gives rigor, but a local concept of reasoning. So the epistemic concentration signifies a grasp of how the movement from premises to conclusion contributes to its development of some architectural theme of local subject matter. In short, it marks the presence of a comprehending universal in the difference through which it persists. By condensing the content of the premise to the content of the conclusion as a development of an architecture, we use the faculty of intuition, and the inference becomes synthetic. By intuition, we combine Ernst Mach's principle of economy of thought, he said, with the concept of harmony. Thanks to fortunate invention of language that introduce an order structure, the complexity of a domain of objects is made more harmonious by introducing of an invariance. We will see in a moment that Poincaré's fortunate invention of language leads to explanatory proof in today's terminology, as was done by Kitcher and others. First, I will just say, Poincaré and Wittgenstein copied Poincaré. Wittgenstein defended later both arguments of Poincaré. The harmful thing about logical technique is that it makes us forget the special mathematical technique, he says. And the second point is much more stronger. Poincaré did not believe that formal logic, whatever is special from my be, could express the essential structure of a proof in lieu of this understanding. So Wittgenstein says, I quote him, everything that I see really amounts to this, that one can know a proof thoroughly and follows it step by step, and yet at the same time not understand what it was that was proved. Das ist Wittgenstein. And Poincaré said in 1908, when the logicians has solved each demonstration into a host of elementary operation, all of them correct, he will not be in possession of the whole reality. That indefinable something that constitutes the unity of the demonstration will still escape him completely. You see, Wittgenstein completely imitated Poincaré. And in fact, together with a long philosophical tradition, mathematical practice shows that there exists an opposition between explanatory and non-explanatory proofs. The latter convinced us but do not explain, gives no deep reason, do not give an understanding. The former gives not only the conviction that the result is true, but show why it is true. Poincaré's attempt to answer the challenge facing the difficulties of explanatory proofs consists in applying the proof to the proof and understanding by the tool of pragmatic, of a pragmatic turn. The meaning of a premise are connected with the semiotic analysis of the implication. This I will explain better in the next lecture. In the spirit of Nelson Goodman, I argue for the thesis that the difference between the multiple ways of finding a cognitive evidence by perception, by intuition, of a first pre-linguistic level or of a higher conceptual level depends neither on the status the involved objects might have, nor on the cognitive capacity used. Rather, it is determined by the pragmatic use one makes of the semiotic system implied. The inseparability, the interdependence between a singular and a general sign perspective is a symptom of intuitive use. The singular element presents as general. This is as an example of Joseph Chastre. We are about as familiar with image of ducks as we are with image of rabbits, and we are unable to decide whether the picture, this picture here, as a singular, is of a rabbit or a duck, as a general. However, implicit preferences when learning about your environment mean that we might be more familiar with one than the other. An inhabitant of a rabbit farm where no ducks live would probably see a rabbit, if there are no other psychological factors involved, such as saturation. Its immediate interpretation is a representation of a rabbit or a duck, is not a deliberate choice, but depends on your experience. It's a strong induction. And this sort of induction is working in mathematics. This intuitive induction is working in mathematics. That's to say, is this one is a rabbit, it's a duck. In order to the intuitive representation I read as a quote, I will explain this later. I should come to the end. Three characteristics of Poincaré's philosophy that at the same time arguments in favor of Poincaré as a philosopher in analytic tradition. I will now recapitulate to end three characteristics of Poincaré's philosophy. Voilà. As with Frege's sense of sentence, Poincaré's sense of convention is neither based on empirical data nor on private events. With this respect, Poincaré survives Wine's critique on logical empiricism for his conception of geometrical conception as a kind of bicephalous reflection of non-synthetic and non-analytic proposition guided at the same time by experience, as I explained. However, reluctantly, Poincaré prepared the way for a later anti-inductivist philosophy of science. Without being Kantian, this is not the point. The anti-inductivist, without being Kantian, without transcendentalisms. Also, theories seem to be introduced in slow stage from phenomena. The starting point in reality, a combination of invented phenomena and conceptual feature, groups or a priori principle, put together in a pragmatic conventional procedure which is irreducible to a combination of clearly distinguished part of observation and logic. This is Goodman's equilibrium. Before Goodman's introduction of the cognitive turn in aesthetics, it was therefore to be clear how to interpret Poincaré's statement in favor of the cognitive rule of aesthetics in proof. Symptoms of an aesthetic proof, it's a better proof understanding, are semantic density, what accounts for its generativity, and syntactic repleteness in terms of the lack of superfluous semiotic marks. Poincaré introduced in mathematical reasoning Mach principles of economy of thought. That means a proof which is less complicated is better for understanding. Today's sustained etiological proof conception is not distinctive for a non-analytical spirit. The non-Fregean logic, Frege's use of a topic neutral versus domain-restricted general laws in order to distinguish between analytic and synthetic judgment is strongly reminiscent of Aristotle's prohibition to go from one sort of kind to another kind, from one discipline to another discipline. Thus, for instance, one must not use an arithmetical layout to demonstrate a geometrical theorem. This was the traditional natural view. Poincaré, as well as Peirce, applied the topic neutral, domain-restricted distinction, not generally, but with respect to different levels of complexity into mathematics. On one non-complex mathematical level, naturally, it is logical reasoning alone, which is sufficient. The understanding is given by logical rigor. But on the complex problem, if there are no categorical structure, as in group theory, I mean, if there are categorical structure are categorical, this is not interesting for mathematicians. This is interesting for philosophers of mathematics, which are not mathematicians. But for philosophers of mathematics, what is interesting is complicated mathematical structures. And da Poincaré, he thought at first that non-Euclidean geometry is necessary to resolve the Fuchsian function, automorphous function, to resolve the three-body problem in astronomy. He uses non-Euclidean geometry. In physics, the Kantian, the philosopher says, oh, what happens? According to Hindika, Poincaré's rejection of the Frege type notation helped him to see the conceptual situation with respect to Richard's paradox more accurately, the impredicativity. Until Hindika switched from the traditional Frege Russell first-order logic to if logic, logicians and mathematicians did not know how to implement Poincaré's insight. Since the principle of induction is expressible in if logic, to take creativity as a criterion for separating logic from mathematics is no longer possible. So Poincaré's valuable argument against logic concerns only the order of understanding. Naturally, now, today, the creativity is in logic and in mathematics. Once the development, last slide, I think, once the development of logic and analytic philosophy is taken into consideration, Poincaré must be considered as one of the most prominent sources of the analytic tradition in the 21st century. His originality consists in the fact that he works on the border between science-centered and art-centered philosophy. Scientific questions have aesthetic solutions. In this sense, he is an anti-Wittgensteinian. Thanks. a lot.
Thank you, Professor Heinzmann. That was a really great talk. And next up, we will have our commentator, Dr. KaiBo, to give his comments.
Yes. Thank you for giving me this chance, and it is my honor to be the commentator of Professor Heinzmann's talk. Professor Heinzmann's talk gives us a very clear image of the role played by Poncare in the tradition of analytic philosophy. And I also have some questions for Professor Heinzmann. My question is that the talk mentioned that Hindekar's invention of independence-friendly logic was inspired by Poincaré's criticism concerning the formal logic in its application in mathematics. We know that independence-friendly logic extends the vocabulary of first-order logic and becomes much more expressible than first-order logic. However, it also has a price, which means that it lost many nice properties of first-order logic, such as completeness in axiomatization. From the perspective of Hindekar, from the talk, we know that the independence-friendly logic, he thinks that it implements Poincaré's insight. Since Poincaré does not have the chance to see the invention of the independence-friendly logic, my question is that had Poincaré seen Hindekar's work, would he be satisfied with Hindekar's solution and withdraw his criticism toward the application of formal logic? If he had seen the Hindekar's work, if he will be convinced by Hindekar's solution. For instance, you in the talk you mentioned that Poincaré also emphasized that the logic should be able to prove any correct things, which is very similar to completeness. However, Hindekar's solution takes completeness as a price for and trade it for expressivity to solve the problem. So my question is that, do you think had Poincaré seen Hindekar's work, whether he will be really convinced by Hindekar?
Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting question. I cannot give a completely satisfactory answer for the following reason. You know, surely that it is controversially discussed if Hindekar's if logic is first order or not. Hindekar says that it is, but it is not so clear. And if this problem were resolved positively, it would be the solution of Poncare. This is clear. But the problem is naturally with the actions of choice. In fact, you know this. This is equivalent to the actions of choice to interpret if you have the independently formula.
Yes.
And the actions of choice is called by Poncare. He's accepted by Poncare. Is accepted by Poncare as a synthetic a priori principles, as he accepted complete induction. Now, for the complete induction, he says they have he goes as the borderline to argument that it is predicative, and then he remarks on the last step, it is not predicative, and we should have a very strong sort of intuition that means that there is no non-standard model. This we should have as intuition. But how should one characterize the intuition necessary for the axioms of choice? This is easy. I think it is better characterized by Hindika's characterization. You understand the choice by the independently logic than on the otherwise round. But I think I would. What is the competition? I would be happy to ask you a question and to make in competition Hindika's solution with Martin Löff's type theory. Which is better? It is not. I think it is not done. This comparison. I should ask Johan van Bentham if it is done.
He just gave a talk last week here.
What? He gave a talk here.
He just gave us the talk last week.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
In this forum.
Yeah. I should ask him what do you think about? I cannot. I have no idea. I don't know. But I think is the Poincaré would discuss the axiom of choice and there are different forms, and I don't know how to you know there are a book of Jensen or Yesh who wrote a book, entire book about a different version of the actions of choice and their equivalents. So, but I cannot say more. But I think this is my conviction that Poncare would be happy on Hindika's solution. Yes, and there's mine. I mean, that's it is in fact the vicious circle principle which is the basis on Poincaré and by Hindika from that's to introduce this principle, his logic and Poincaré's principle. Okay.
Poncare is whether he thinks that completeness in whether or not it's complete axiomatizable is a big problem for him.
No. This is not problem. This is only a problem for logicians. For with you a formal, we'll see that the semantic and the syntax should be the same, be correspond. But for Poincaré, that's not a problem. It's only a problem for the logical, and you know that's the completeness proof is a philosophically proof which uses so strong tools, mathematical tools, much that it's not. It is just to convince logician, but it's not to convince the
so he won't. So you think that Poncare will not think that lost the completeness in axiomatization is a big drawback in Hindika's solution? Okay. Now I see. Thank you. So maybe we can leave more time for others listeners to raise their questions.
So we're now opening the floor So if you're in this Zoom chat room, you can just raise your hand and ask a question. For our audience on the streaming platform 学术志, you can leave your questions on the chat box, and the questions will be forwarded to Professor Heinzmann. And so there seems to be no question in this Zoom meeting, so I will use my privilege to ask my own question. So my apologies in advance if it's sort of off topic, but I'm really interested in Poincaré's theory about geometry, as you just introduced. Everything is pretty new to me, and I think it's just a clarification question. So it seems to me in the theory, there are just two primitive notions, changes not accompanied by muscular sensation and changes accompanied by muscular sensations. So I'm curious about two questions. So the first one is, does this mean that Poincaré thinks that what grounds all geometric properties will be something related to our muscular sensation? It just appears to be incredible to me, but it's also like very interesting. And the second question is, I don't know whether if it's related to the first one. I'm wondering if those two relations or properties, changes accompanied by muscular sensations and changes not accompanied by muscular sensations. I wonder whether the definition based on those two just only relies on the structural feature or the structural relations between the two, rather than like some substantive use of the notion of muscular sensation. Or to put it in another way, say, suppose there is like no muscle, right, in our actual worlds, then I guess a pair of concepts like those are still gonna work to in order to define geometry or explain geometry. Is that right?
The first question, I didn't exactly grasp the second question, but I will. Don't know if I understand well, but I will begin with the first. You ask naturally a very good question. This is the point, and there was Mach, and I think you remember I said in my talk that Poincaré's conception is philosophically very interesting, but finally not working mathematically. There is the following reason. First of all, naturally, Poincaré was convinced that geometry is geometry of constant curvature. So but this is not a big problem. So Riemann's geometry should just called mathematics. It is not geometry. So geometry is a constant curvature. But then there is an observation of Mach, and I think of all of us today. And this is, but sensation, are sensation not electric movement or something like this? Naturally, they are. They are. So they presuppose space. because electric is always. But Poincaré was not concerned with this objection because he said emergent sensation. But emergent sensations are not sensations. So, in fact, what he is doing, he takes over Helmholtz's conception of imagination, emergent intuition, and use this for sensation. But is it not, in fact, relationships now between the group concept and reality, between group concept and another concept, which is this of sensation, the concept of sensation, because this is emergent sensation, it's not sensations. It's only emergent sensations. And then in the end of his construction, for space, he must be sure that the space should give a dimension. How decide between a dimension? And there he uses Lee's group theory. And Lee's group theory is about the R3, and the three-dimensional space of real numbers. So naturally, if you characterize group theory already by Lee's group theory, you are circular. And but then in a second, Poincaré remarks this mistake, and he says, okay, what we should presuppose now is a topological space. We should have a topological intuition, and then he can introduce without using the Lie group this dimension, but can keep his original Lie group construction without a dimension. So okay, so he repairs it, but in fact you are right. The sensation, the problem is with the sensation. If the sensation is only a theoretical concept of sensation, naturally we imagined a sensation, we imagined to turn about a sphere and all this. But on the other hand, naturally you can do it. You can do it. This has a real realization. So, what you are thinking about this? So you have imagined realization, but naturally you can do it. And we tried to reconstruct his geometry. So you can imagine this rotation and what is translation, what is done for Euclidean geometry is easier to do than for non-Euclidean geometry. But it is just it is what means easier. So there are a lot of if you go in the details, there are a lot of things which are not working, but what is working is the general tool that in philosophy of science would make an equilibrium process of experience and not only that we understand. In fact, I think we understand geometry better in Poincaré's way than we have just the action system, naturally. We have and this is Poincaré. He wrote the report on Hilbert's axiom system of geometry, this famous on 1899. And Hilbert so received the Boulay Prize because of Poincaré's report. Poincaré remarks, okay, logically this is fine, but I cannot understand geometry. I cannot understand it. And let's decide.
Okay, thank you, Professor. It's very, very helpful. So I haven't received any questions from other people, so I guess it's safe to assume that we have no further questions this time. And at this point, I want to announce that Professor Heinzmann's next lecture will be on next Friday, the same time, 7 o'clock for people in China. So let's thank Professor Heinzmann for this excellent talk, and we are looking forward to the next.
I thank you. I'm very happy to have seen you and about your question. Very, very good. I hope we can see you in the future.
Thank you.
More often. Okay. Thank you.
See you next week.
Thank you. See you next week.